of the speaker series run through the Digital Humanities Initiative at the Research Institute for the Humanities here at CUHK. This is our second meeting in as many weeks, and I'm glad to see some familiar names as well as some new ones, and I'm sure we'll be joined by more people in the next couple of minutes. Just to let you know, we will be meeting again on October 3rd, where we're going to be listening to Adam Crimble from UCLA. They, of course, have a very significant DH sort of tradition, as well as a number of degree programs, which some of you may have heard of. So it'd be very interesting to see his perspective from one of the great sort of world centers of DH. Today we have someone else from one of the leading world centers in DH, one of Stanford's movers and shakers, a teacher, a scholar, and somebody I had the pleasure of meeting earlier in the year here when she was visiting Hong Kong. This is today's speaker, Quinn Dombrowski, who comes to us from Stanford, where it is, I think, the middle of the night. So we're very grateful for her to for taking 9 p.m. Okay, well, we know for people like me, that's the middle of the night. But
I know, I feel you. Absolutely. Morning person. Like,
yeah, exactly.
We do what we can.
Exactly. Where she is, I understand, academic technology specialist in literatures, cultures and languages at the Center for Interdisciplinary Digital Research. If I'm getting that right.
You got it.
Okay, good. She has a very interesting background, both in tech, librarianship, and also Slavic languages and linguistics. So she's the perfect person, I guess, to talk to us about textual questions and DH. Before going to Stanford in 2018, she worked at another important Bay Area institution, which shall remain nameless, and at UC Berkeley, and also I believe worked at the University of Chicago as well. So a very illustrious and interesting career. She's been involved in many projects. I encourage you to look up the various things she's been involved in. Some really interesting and unusual projects that have really pushed the boundaries of digital humanities in various ways. Today, however, she is going to be speaking to us on the topic of who did what, the challenges of multilingual text analysis, grammar, and copyright. So Quinn, it's over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Stuart. And it's wonderful to be back at HKU, albeit virtually. Had a wonderful trip here at the end of May. And yeah, I look forward to someday when I can return, and not only in the little black box on Zoom. And yes, apologies in advance for any degree of slight befuddlement here. Yeah, as a morning person, 9:04 p.m. is just about when like my brain shuts off for the day. But we've had some caffeine, we will rally, it'll be fine. Okay. So I also get bored easily and just can't leave well enough alone with talks that I have given before. So this is a brand new mix of different things that I put together, thinking it might make for some interesting discussion points on the fronts of multilingual DH and assorted other adjacent issues that we have to contend with. So we will do some screen sharing here for the slides. There we go. Let me make these full screen if I can manage to move the Zoom window. All right. Okay. Who did what? The challenges of multilingual DH, text analysis, grammar, and copyright. A wonderful, wonderful set of issues that we all deal with in some form or another when working on computational text analysis. So a bit of a roadmap here in my dive down this rabbit hole, starting with the question of who cares about computational text analysis anyways? What questions can we ask using these methods? Thinking about languages and syntax, syntax being kind of like where things are relative to each other and what their relationship is, in terms of grammar, and then corpora and copyright. So towards the end, we'll get into things that I think a lot of people maybe dismiss because they seem kind of boring and not directly related to the work we do and the questions we ask. But hopefully by the end, it'll all make sense and people will have kind of a different perspective on how languages, syntax, corpora, and copyright really are fundamental in some ways to the kind of work we do and questions we ask. So starting with who cares about computational text analysis? Generally, not people who do literary analysis using traditional methods. And so recently, of course, as you've probably run into in the news, about a year ago, Elon Musk had bought Twitter, and DH Twitter was a phenomenal space. It was a space that I came up in my time in DH. I first joined Twitter in 2007, right before the DH 2007 conference, and for all these years it was a space where people would live tweet conferences, would sort of share questions, would have kind of a community discourse. And I think the sign that it is not quite up to there's been various attempts to recreate DH Twitter and other spaces as Twitter itself has become increasingly unpalatable with its current leadership. And a lot of people have moved over to a place called Blue Sky, which is invite only. We'll have a link to the invite form at the end if you'd like to join us over there. But I think one sign that it is not quite up to par with old DH Twitter is the fact that I threw out this question of, I could have sworn there was an article a few years ago that sort of showed in a like tracking citations, actual like bibliometric sense, that people don't cite DH work. And no one was able to come up with this reference, but I am nonetheless like pretty confident that I'm not making this up, or I don't have this as a sort of like weird dream or memory. I am pretty sure that somewhere out there there are actual statistics that show that people who do traditional literary analysis do not cite computational methods, and people who write those papers, even though a lot has been published. One of the interesting things about DH is there's always this tension between, oh, DH is super new, it's a really new field, so you can't expect X, Y, and Z, where X, Y, and Z might be like figuring out citational practices or credit for grad students or things like that. On the other hand, I mean, the modern incarnation of this field is getting on like 30 years old, and there's been a lot of work published, but generally it really has not made an impact on traditional literary studies. You would think that if someone could prove computationally that like Shakespeare is who Shakespeare was, this would be a reassuring thing. This would be something that people would appreciate, knowing that all of the discussions over the years, like they could move on to other topics because we had figured this out computationally. We have evidence, we have data, we can sort of like prove our workflow and show these things, and then the field can move on. But by and large, like people who do these methods traditionally don't really engage with the work being done in digital humanities. And I feel like this leads to a little bit of question around the idea of there to this day there is still this discourse that like, well, give it enough time and like all humanities work will be digital humanities. Everyone will be doing digital humanities. You hear this quoted particularly by deans and people in power who are funding digital humanities, which is great. Please don't stop funding digital humanities. That's what I do. But I don't actually think that's the case. I had conversations this last week at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign with people who believe that like all humanities will become digital humanities. I think at least within the context of the US, traditional humanities, such as it is more likely to collapse and be eliminated financially before it becomes digital humanities, which is grim, but I think it's right. But I think, part of that has to do with the concrete methods we use and the kinds of questions that we can ask using computational methods. So, you know, then there's the question of, okay, so even if you grant me that people who do traditional methods humanities don't cite digital humanities, you could ask the question, does it matter? Does it matter that traditional literary scholars don't engage with the work that we do, that they don't show up to our events, they don't read our articles? And there's sort of this growing wall between people who have cultivated, again, over 30 years at this point, a field and its methods, and the people who came before it and still continue. um I think it does matter. I think that, organizational structures are something that don't change overnight, and I wouldn't necessarily want them to change all that much. By organizational structures, I have in mind things like departments. A department of digital humanities or a program in digital humanities doesn't spring up overnight. And if it sort of exists, then as a separate silo from the rest of the humanities, then this sort of exacerbates the feeling of there being a zero-sum game between digital humanities and the rest of the humanities. Every student that digital humanities gets is one fewer student in, regular humanities, if you will. And also community at the same time. Even if we're going at these questions in very different ways, it's just a wonderful thing to have people who care about the things that you care about, even if they care about them in different ways than you do. Which leads me to conclude that, like, really the number of people who care at all about the world's literature and cultural heritage, and thinking about what all of it means, um is really too small in the end to be splitting permanently into these smaller factions when entire areas of study are under threat. There's been a lot of things in the news in the last couple months in the United States about, major, flagship universities within states eliminating all of their foreign language programs and foreign language literature programs. So everything other than English. And there's a lot of things other than English in the world. All of those gone. And whenever there is a consolidation or a defunding, non-English literatures are often the first to go. So I think it really is in our collective interest to, wherever we can, make common cause with those people who are invested in the kinds of things that we are invested in, even if the ways that we go about doing it are very, very different. So asking different questions, this is part of the promise and the peril of digital humanities. This was part of the idea of why digital humanities was exciting and great in the beginning, and people would try to, like, sell digital humanities. This idea that digital humanities methods allow us to ask different questions than we could without the computational respect. And again, like 30 years in, there have been several monographs focusing on computational text analysis methods and the kinds of questions that we can ask and answer using those methods, from the angle of computational literary studies. These include Distant Horizons by Ted Underwood, Macroanalysis by Matt Jockers, and with a East Asian angle, The Values and Numbers: Reading Japanese Literature in a Global Information Age by Hoyt Long. In addition to this, there are just many other works that include in some aspect, like, digital humanities methods as part of making an argument. More and more scholars who have come up through programs like Stanford's Literary Lab, or the University of Chicago, or the University of Virginia. There are several sort of digital humanities degrees in Western Europe. There are lots of people who have kind of done full educational trajectories using digital humanities methods. And these people have tenure track jobs now, and they're writing books, all centered on this approach. And there's a thrill in being able to ask different questions here. On one hand, we want to make common cause with people who do traditional literary methods, but, like, honestly, especially in fields like Shakespeare studies, and I don't mean to only pick on Shakespeare, but in fields like Shakespeare studies, there's at least looking to me at the field, sometimes I get the sense that, like, you could use a set of methods that allow you to ask different questions, because so many people have asked the same kinds of questions for tens and hundreds at this point of years now. And being able to ask different questions is good. But at the same time, when you ask different questions, this suddenly means that there's a set of things that people can react to and choose not to participate in, and choose that these are questions that they are not interested in pursuing. And I think from there is where some of our struggles come in terms of engaging with the rest of these fields. So among the methods that have been around for quite some time now, are not computationally all that challenging, don't require the same level of server requirements and like big scale computation that some other methods that have come along since require. Among these is topic modeling. And for those of you who haven't done much with topic modeling before, there's an idea of topics, which basically just means clusters of words that tend to occur together in a document. And I think a lot of tears have been shed with people who have confused the idea of topics as they are defined in topic modeling, this computational method. It's just words that tend to occur together, which roughly maps to our conceptual idea of like a topic, but like not always. And they tend to occur together in a document, which is another word that has led to much sorrow. Where if you ask people what a document is, people tend to think they understand this, and they do understand it in a certain way. But a document for purposes of topic modeling is basically like a chunk of text, ideally that is coherent with regard to like what topics it's discussing. If you decide that your document is a book, you will be sad with your results. Like, I tell you, as someone who has been there and done that and made that mistake many times. So yeah, our topic models document, and for that matter, our topic models topic, and our concept of like what a document is and what a topic are, from the humanities, are often different. And this involves sort of wrapping your head around multiple different sets of jargon if you're going to go about doing this. So this is an example from Macroanalysis, Matt Jocker's book, where he took 19th century and before American and British literature and did some topic modeling on it. And he came up with 200 topics that were the topics that this model found across this literature. And not all of them are kind of comprehensible, or things that you can look at as a human and be like, oh, I know what cluster of words this is. Because topic modeling usually does produce like some buckets that like just don't really cohere all that well, that don't necessarily make a lot of sense. But this is like number one. This is the topic that if you look at it, like I think we all can more or less agree that like this is animals and beasts and things like that. You can see the larger the word is, the higher probability of that word occurring in this topic and not the other, and like not so prominently necessarily in the other 199 topics. So number one is animal. Number two is animals, because of the way that he pre-processed the text. He didn't collapse the singular and plural, which many people debate about how much you should do this anyways, if you're doing topic modeling. We see beast and beasts and horns and creatures and wolves and elephants and brutes and herds and hunters and teeth and species and so on down the line. So you can do this. You can take a bunch of literature and topic model it, and then look at how frequently people use this topic, how frequently people use these words across different parameters. So if you look at the top right graph, we see looking at this from like 1760 to 1890, color coded by gender. So female, gender of author. So female is the black, male is the darker gray, and unknown is the light gray. And then on the bottom we see American is black, British is dark gray, and Irish is light gray. So this could potentially, I think, be interesting. And full confession here, my background is in Slavic linguistics, and I come from the University of Chicago, where like many departments, there was like a huge chasm between the linguists in the department and the literature people in the department. They were suspicious of us because we didn't really read books, and we were suspicious of them because we thought they were running a book club instead of a proper research department. So not a lot of charitability on either side, for either side. But as someone who came up on linguistics but like has been working now in a literature department for 5 years, I feel like this could be like, this should be something that is interesting. But it isn't always. This can be something that's really hard to convey to people, to translate to people about why it's interesting without a lot of additional steps. There's often this reaction in digital humanities work where we say, oh look, references to animals, is much higher among male authors and female authors, as we see in the chart in the upper right. And the traditional method literary scholars will just sort of look at you and be like, yes, well, obviously, like we knew that. When will you tell us anything actually new or different with your new methods? I mean, it's a struggle, especially so when the way that we go about approaching these questions feels like really alien. Throw it in a jumped up word hopper, and then you get something like this out the other side, and it can be hard for people to follow. There's another set of things that people have done for a long time, again, because it doesn't require a lot of computational power to do it, and that's various flavors of word counting. And like, word counting can be great. I teach word counting to students all the time, and at least for students who are trying to pursue a traditional literary path, or a path that's more traditional but maybe supported a little bit behind the scenes with digital methods. Word counting can be phenomenal. It can be a way to really just like turbocharge and like rocket power your close reading. The things that we can do with like just sort of a very basic control F style, like let's search for some words. The ability to pull out like every single reference to trees with an easy query on the text. It's amazing. I mean, just compared to the prospect of reading it on paper, or even reading it, if you had an EPUB, but didn't have search capabilities. Suddenly you can look for every single instance of the word tree in a novel, or in 10 novels, 100 novels, and 1,000 novels, in a way that just like technically could be done without computers, but it would be very challenging and time consuming, and exhausting to try to do that without the help of computers. I think where we get into trouble with digital methods, by which I mean, like, on one hand we have something to offer because we have a different way of looking at the problem, but the way we go about doing it really estranges a lot of traditional scholars, is that we don't just count things and then read the examples and then go about traditional analysis. We do an analysis that is based on counting things, but we take it in a different direction, other than like, and then we read it with our eyeballs and thought about it and came to some conclusion. So one of the methods that we use here, that I've used in texts, as has the literary lab, is something called principal component analysis. So the way this works in practice is you count some number of words, and then you flatten it into a space. So the number of words you count, can vary, and what kinds of words you count can vary. If you're looking at the top words overall, so like what are the 1,000 most frequent words in a text, you're going to get text clustering a little bit differently than if you look at the top 1,000 nouns, for instance. So this is part of a Stanford Literary Lab project that was looking at typicality in the novel. Like, what is the most typical novel? This is a project that Mark Algie Hewitt did. And he took, all of, I think it was 19th century literature, one of these giant page corpora, and he looked at the nouns, and basically extracted all nouns from the text and then counted the top 1,000 nouns in those texts. And what he found was very clear clustering of these texts. Once you took that 1,000 dimension visualization that's hard for us to even imagine in our mind, based on like the numbers of instances that like each of the top 1,000 nouns occurred in that particular text. Like if you take this 1,000 dimension array and flatten it into 2D, you get something like this. And there are these very clear clusters of things. You can find this way a cluster of like nautical tales. You can find a cluster of mysteries. You can find a cluster of romances. It works out remarkably well, and depending on how you want to how you want to think about the most typical novel, this sort of puts you in different spaces within this arrangement. So to the question of what happens when we measure different things, when we count different words, I had a little project as part of the Data Sitters Club, which is one of the computational text analysis pedagogy projects that I do, where we basically go try out different methods on a corpus of beloved American 80s and 90s girls series literature about a club of girls who go babysit children and also like thwart criminals. There's a mystery sub series. There's like a whole bunch of things that they end up doing over the course of like their 8th and 9th grade years. So we took those books which are represented in like orange and green and brown, and then compared them to other popular series books, and then tried it 2 different ways. We tried it on the left is just the nouns, and on the right is the total words. And some of these turn out to be like roughly the same. But what's really interesting is if you compare the nouns, which kind of get at like what is this book about? Like what is it talking about? You get a different arrangement with some of these series than if you look at the top total words, which these are like super frequent and boring, contentless words in some sense. Words like the and of, your prepositions, your articles and things like that. That really get to the question of authorship, because one of the most interesting and like baffling, like you wouldn't think it would work this way, but the interesting things that digital humanities methods have proven is that each author has kind of like a separate ratio of these things to each other. So you can actually fairly reliably do authorship analysis just based on the frequency of these small boring words. So as you can see, comparing the left and the right, on the left, you see the red and the pink, which are Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, are super just like smushed together. Like both of them are mystery series for kids. And they're next to, but not really intermixed with, the Boxcar Children, which is another kind of like mystery series for kids. But on the right, when we look at like authorship, we see that Nancy Drew is suddenly like entirely separate from Hardy Boys, and Hardy Boys is thoroughly intermixed with Boxcar Children. And what this tells me, sort of knowing what I know of this data, is that this points to the fact that the Hardy Boys series and the Boxcar Children series shared ghostwriters. They were both ghostwritten series, and there were ghostwriters who did both of them, whereas the pool of ghostwriters for Nancy Drew was a separate pool, which I think is kind of interesting. So the nice thing about doing methods like this, be it word counts of various sorts, or topic modeling, is that at least for English, you don't need syntax. You're just counting words. You're not looking at the relationship to each other. With topic models, they're explicitly treated as like a bucket of words, without a lot of consideration for like what is next to it. Like, is it sort of in the same document together, or is it not? Not like, are they next to each other or not? And so as a result, you have access to data sets that basically, get rid of syntax, get rid of any form where you could coherently read it as a human in order to align with copyright concerns. So looking at the HathiTrust Research Center, which is just an incredible resource, out of the University of Illinois. The HathiTrust is, if you remember, maybe 10 years ago, Google was scanning, hundreds and thousands of books, and there was a lawsuit about whether they were allowed to do this and put snippets of the text on the internet, and ultimately the decision was yes. But as part of making nice here, Google, partnered with this thing that became HathiTrust to say, okay, we're scanning all these books from university libraries. Initially there was a large batch of those, and Google said that they would give all of those scans back both to the source library and to this thing called HathiTrust. So all of the books that Google scanned, and many books that have been scanned since, end up in this giant data set where you can search for books. If you have access to the books, like sort of through a membership of this organization, you can view the book if it's out of copyright. Anyone can view the book out of copyright. You can use some in copyright stuff depending on your university affiliation, and anyone in the world can use this extracted features data set, which is 17.1 million texts, and it has word counts for each of those. So using extracted features, it includes in copyright texts. It's easy to access. You can just like go to this website and download it. You can use it anywhere. You can run your analysis on your computer or in your cloud, at your university in some form, your high performance computing cluster, and you get more or less same size buckets of words because the way the data is broken down is like page by page. So this is the kind of data that would allow you to do the kinds of analysis that we've talked about so far. Ted Underwood, a lot of his work is based on HathiTrust data. It's just an incredible set of corpora, with both in and out of copyrighted texts. So this is an example of what the extracted features data set looks like. And I know it's your eyes may be sort of skewing a little bit just looking at this. But it's not too bad if you break it down. So the sequence in the upper left hand side here where it says 0005, that's the page number. So on page 5 of this book, there are 441 tokens or words. There are 104 lines. There are 19 empty lines, 7 sentences. And within sort of the body of the thing, you can see more or less the same thing. The metrics that they have feel kind of weird to me, personally. Like the idea that you would count how many words begin with a particular letter. There might be some kinds of like kind of art books that where a writer might be playing with that in some way, acronyms and acrostics and things like that. But like when I look at a text, I don't start like counting how many words begin with the letter N. But that is how that is the metric that they crunch for you for better or for worse. They also have the end character, which like in English is most often E. So there you have it. Even I will confess, feel a sense of like, yes, we we know this. We know that words end with E in English, many of them. But so be it. And then we see a list of all of the words that are on the page. Not in any particular order as far as I know. It's not in the order that they occur, I don't think, because that would be giving you too much information about like how you might reconstruct this page if you wanted to make it readable by people. But for each of the words, you see part of speech information and how many times it occurs on this page. So 15 times E with a period, somebody's like middle initial occurs in this page, and it's a noun or noun phrase, and then P. You see some verbs, you see some punctuation, you see some adjectives. This is all using like a not the world's most transparent system of coding. The language, it's based on the old Stanford NLP parser, which at this point is fairly it's definitely like an older generation of technology for this kind of work. So as usual, there's a certain set of affordances you get for something like this for English, but things get harder beyond English. And as the person in the non-English, non-East Asian, non-classics, but all the other languages department, and I do deal with East Asian languages with students in my classes. This is a really common problem. Like, you show them the tool and you sort of show them the possibilities of the tool, but then cruelly you like yank it all back and be like, well, that was English. And things get harder if you're not working in English. So I was looking around for some examples of something in Chinese for this occasion, and like, apologies, I do not read Chinese. But this is one example that I was able to grab. You can see the beginning character count, the end character count, same as the English data. And on this one, you do actually get some part of speech information, which, again, not being able to read it might be completely wrong. I will be curious in the Q&A if anyone has comments on exactly how wrong this is. That one, though, was actually quite good compared to some other texts that I found. This was another sort of sometimes English, sometimes Chinese text. And this one, like, it just did a horrible job at recognizing that there are characters or, English words in there whatsoever. Like, the image on the left, it corresponds to the data on the right, but as you can see, like, none of the characters are there at all. And for the example of for the page on the right here with the data above it, it just couldn't find any characters at all on that page. The optical character recognition, and then the parsing of that was just so bad that like there's nothing there. So like, while this book exists in HathiTrust and it's part of, however many thousands of Chinese texts that are available through this resource, it is functionally unusable. All right. As another example, closer to the area of the world that I have worked on, this is a Ukrainian text, and it's better than what we have for Chinese, but one of the crucial differences here is that, in contrast to the better performing Chinese text, we don't have any grammatical information whatsoever. Everything is unknown, the UNK here. And so, this is again what we get. Like, some languages have support, some languages don't. Some languages have had computational algorithms for like quite some time now. Some, don't or use different, more recent technology. And when you're dealing with a resource like HathiTrust that works with this older layer of technology, you have a lot of things missing for, most of the world's languages. Something interesting here is, if you look at the bottom right of this document, you can see the calculated language is Russian. Like, it misidentified that this even is Ukrainian. And then sort of things went downhill from there. Russian, I believe, may actually be supported by the Stanford NLP parser that's being used here, but Ukrainian is not, and that's why like nothing really works. So what if we didn't lose syntax? What if we worked with the full text of things, and weren't limited to dealing with this derivative data because of copyright concerns and shareability and open science? Like, what if we worked with digital texts in their initial form? So here's an example of something that we were able to do as part of that same Data Sitters Club project, where we had the full text of the full text of the books, and in multiple different versions, and then we were able to compare them. So one thing that we were able to do in having the full text and not just sort of like a mishmash of like information about word frequencies per page was we were able to identify points where people had changed the text. So the Babysitters Club came out in the 80s and 90s. And there are definitely some like kind of cringy like 80s references, like, getting a perm, which you might do in 1989, but you certainly wouldn't do in 2019. And so we were able to find, by comparing versions of this text and having the full text, all the words in their correct order, we were able to find where people had done some editing in re-releasing the books. And this was a point that, you know, I was very excited about, that, like, we had actually identified like what these places were. Sadly though, you know, being able to answer questions using methods that are more human comprehensible and not as abstract as topic modeling or principal component analysis, is no guarantee that it will resonate with your audience. And the entire you know, premise of this piece that we ended up writing about finding changes in literature, you know, came down to the fact that you know, children's literature scholars like our colleague Maria Sachiko-Sasiri on that project don't actually necessarily find that all that interesting. Like, it's a well-known thing within their field that you know, children's literature gets changed across the generations in order to, you know, accommodate modern norms, you know, to, you know, deal with updates to currency and inflation. And this is just something that people know. The image on the right is an example of how the Oompa Loompas were illustrated differently in Willy Wonka in the 1964 version and even the 1973 version, to sort of deal with the, like, pretty overt racism of the original illustrations. Having syntax alone and being able to answer more tractable questions doesn't necessarily mean that, like, this will speak to our colleagues who do non-computational work. There are other methods though that need syntax and add context. So word embeddings being one of them, and then anything that involves natural language processing, including lemmatizing, which is something that you know, we use a lot for Slavic languages and other languages that have a lot of inflections, so that a word may appear in, you know, 5, 10, 16, 30 different forms depending on how it's being used grammatically. And so with those languages, if you want to be able to count anything, you have to lemmatize. The situation is maybe comparable for Chinese, but a bit easier. There you have to segment it, you have to artificially insert spaces in between words. And, you know, context does help with that than if you were to, you know, just sort of have jumbles of text. But you know, it's a little bit simpler. All right, so word embeddings are a really interesting method. You know, speaking of Adam Krimble, who will be giving the next lecture, his programming historian you know, initiative will very soon have its first ever word embeddings lesson. I'm very excited to have helped put that one together. They seem to capture meaning. What they actually encode is co-occurrence and context. So the way these get trained, you know, often is like, you know, the computer will take a snippet of text and hide a word in the middle of the sentence, you know, like the blank chased the cat, and sort of run through the probabilities of different words that could occur in that space. So, you know, the dog chased the cat, like very probable. You know, the yarn chased the cat, like very improbable. And sort of through these like networks of relationships, like it gets to something with you know, what words are like other words, either in their meaning or in their usage. And so this is an example from you know, a Star Wars project that the Stanford Literary Lab did, looking at you know, all the Star Wars novels and from a variety of different angles. So here's something that we can do with this, you know, using syntax that might be potentially kind of interesting to traditional literary scholars. You know, what if we looked at you know, basically animacy, you know, who's doing what are the activities that like different entities or characters are doing in a text, you know, and then sort of look at what are the words that tell us that they are animate or not. And so, you know, unsurprising here, if something is the subject of the verb to do, if something does something or says something or tries or speaks or asks or goes, odds are good that it's animate. You know, knowing, getting, asking, these are all very these are all very active things that like only animate things do. But you know, there are other verbs that, you know, sort of suggest that it is not animate, like being put somewhere. You know, only objects and babies, as it happens, like get put places. They like, you know, are laying places and things like that. So here's another you know, kind of visualization of this as we think about you know, the difference between you know, people and things, and how we use language to talk about them differently. There's baby there in the middle, like, which is really kind of like veering over towards the you know, it's sort of veering towards people, but it's kind of in the middle, closer to things than any other you know, person word. And of course the irregularity in this visualization, if you know things about Star Wars, is that the word jar is like strikingly close to person. But this is kind of an odd artifact of Star Wars, where we have the character of Jar Jar Binks. And so it's not a glass jar, it's this, you know, annoying alien guy. There's also natural language processing, which gets us this kind of information, you know, really that sort of underpins some of that last visualization, looking at the relationship between words and the, you know, verbs that tell us that something is animate or not. Natural language processing, there are, you know, more and more algorithms out there that can do this work, and an increasing number of them, you know, support multiple different languages and different sets of languages than were available earlier. In the days of the Stanford parser, as we were seeing with the extracted features data set from HathiTrust, you know, there was only like a handful of the world's like most common you know, imperial languages available. And now there are more and more languages that, you know, have the training data to be able to do this. So this is an example from one of our Data Sitters Club books. We were comparing English and French. You know, here is an example sentence from one of the books. Claudia ignored the question. And we see, you know, kind of a classic like grammatical sentence diagram here, where Claudia is a proper noun. It is a subject of the sentence, and it's governing the verb ignored. This is the way the sentence like should be diagrammed. So we can do this in interesting ways. Once we've identified the relationship between characters and verbs, we can do things like find what are the verbs that are the most distinctive of a particular character. So, you know, everyone, you know, does, like, you know, said, you know, there's usually dialogue that every character is involved in. But if we basically create a list of all of the verbs that are governed by a particular character in the text, like all of the verbs where this character is the subject of the sentence, and then they do something. We create a bunch of lists, and then sort of look at what are the verbs that are like most characteristic, like of a particular character. You can really get at something kind of remarkably and delightfully about these different characters just by looking at what they do. So Yoda, you know, taught, said, remark, knows, like, and these are sort of like pedagogical verbs. You know, there's kind of wisdom, knowing. You know, Darth Vader, you know, rumbles, strides, orders, kills. Jabba, you know, boomed and rumbled and once and chuckled. Jabba is big on chuckling. The Emperor in Star Wars died. That's the most distinctive thing about him. You know, and we get into sort of like, you know, the Force related verbs for some of these other Jedi. And then we can also, you know, use this to look at what characters have like really distinctive and different sets of verbs. So the Wookiees in Star Wars, because they don't talk, usually they sort of like roar and growl and bark and howl, and you know, they don't use you know, English words. Their verbs end up looking really different. You know, the Force is also like a really different entity. You know, it guides and it flows and it works and it protects in a way that is really different than all these other characters in the thing. And C3PO, you know, translates, cries, reports, explains, you know, is very high anxiety character who also does a lot of translating. And you can sort of see these differences between the characters based on these frequencies of the verbs they're using. Where darker colors here mean more similar, and every character here is on the X and the Y axis. So a light colored line means a character whose verbs are just really different from all the other ones in the data set. So we can also do things like, who's laughing, who's chuckling, who's giggling. Only female characters giggle. Java chuckles a whole lot, more than most people. Lando Calrissian also does a fair amount of chuckling. I wonder if there's some relationship between chuckling and evil doers, or these sort of like morally complicated characters. But like we can do this now, all thanks to NLP. And I thought this is fun too. Looking at yelled, shouted, and cried, which usually means like not tears, but just like exclaimed. Who's yelling? And it turns out that the characters of the more recent trilogy are doing a lot of yelling. Finn yells more than anyone else. And Rey does more yelling than certainly other female characters earlier on in the series. And like these are all things that you could, like, maybe you might notice as a reader, but maybe this is just like a way for you to start thinking about the text differently, and then pursuing a set of research questions, even using traditional methods, beginning from this point of departure of like, why is the volume turned up so loud, and who's doing the yelling, and then thinking about that, even without the aid of some of these more complicated algorithms. But again, it doesn't always work as well beyond English. That example sentence I had earlier, Claudia ignored the question. We also have French translations and multiple different French translations for these books. And as you can see here, these are two ways of translating. Claudia ignored the question. The bottom one, Claudia didn't respond. And we see that Claudia becomes an adjective. And on the top one, ignored is also an adjective. And on the bottom one, Claudia is an adjective, just like hanging out there in space with no grammatical relationship whatsoever to the verb in question, which at least is recognized as a verb. But if you were to try this method and look at like what are the things that Claudia is doing, and you're doing it in the French text, you would not be able to get nearly as much data, because so much of this is just misclassified. You can see on the left here, we actually did try this to pull out, not even looking at like what the verbs were, but like how often were we even able to find these character names along the top: Christy, Marianne, Claudia, Stacy, and Dawn. How often could we find them even as a subject of a sentence? A darker color is better. And as you can see here, like we found a lot of examples of these characters as subjects of sentences in English, and the number drops off precipitously for the different French translations, down to the point where we have 183 sentences with Christy as the subjects in book 2 here, 77 in modern French, 61 in an earlier translation in French, 55 for Belgian, and 54 for a Quebec translation. So like it's just not working well. And what this comes down to is differences in the training data that is used to train these algorithms. So there are so many different tree banks for English, basically sentences that are like fully annotated with the grammatical relationship of all the words to all the other words in the sentences. And you can see from the blue icons in the kind of middle column the diversity of the different kinds of texts that they're working with. There's Wikipedia, there's news sources, there's email, there's court records, there's blog posts, there's spoken corpora, and the diversity just decreases and decreases until you're just looking at news or just Wikipedia. There's like one set of patent data for Chinese, and otherwise we're looking at just like a lot of Wikipedia and news. And the further away from Wikipedia or news that your text is, the less well these algorithms are likely to perform. So this brings me to really a wonderful initiative by David Baman et al. Called Book NLP. And this is an attempt to annotate literary data with that information, grammatical information, but more importantly, information about like what is an entity, like what is a person, what is a location, what is a geopolitical entity, things like that. So usually when they do training data, it's like only proper names, only proper countries and things like that, municipalities and that. But like when we're working with literary data, we're often dealing with like fictional places or government structures that don't exist in reality. We're dealing with fantasy worlds, we're dealing with sci-fi or things that just are not going to perform terribly well if you're just applying an algorithm trained only on news or Wikipedia. So it's just a phenomenally useful project. It originally started as a project called LitBank to annotate this data, but it's developed into a newer version of Book NLP, which is actually a tool that you can use to be able to do this kind of analysis on literary texts. So it can do unnamed entities, so things like Jane's sister. Jane might be pulled out in using a usual algorithm, but like not an unnamed entity like Jane's sister, who may be a very important character, but maybe she's just never named. It does co-reference resolution, which is really important. Very tricky to do computationally, it turns out. So basically turning all of the things like, she and her, all your pronouns back to who they point to. It does character name clustering. So it takes your nicknames and other forms of names and like clusters them together, so that you can, tell all the references to a single character, even if they're referred to in different ways. It does quotation attribution and also event tagging. So like, when do things actually happen? And it's using a more recent library called Spacey, plus the Python transformer library from Hugging Face. There's a link here to download it, and there's a tutorial available by William Mattingly that sort of goes through how you actually use it. It's just a wonderful tool. And it's also multilingual. So the goal in developing this was to, develop it from English using modern technologies, but also develop a French version, a Russian version, and I believe a Japanese and Spanish are underway. So the texts are initially public domain texts, so they're old, which may or may not represent the kinds of texts that you are looking at. Even though they're old, they may be closer to the text that you're looking at than modern news corpora. It's all relative, right? But there are some efforts, working with friendly lawyers about using excerpts from in copyright text. And honestly, it's messy. It depends on the laws of your country about whether you can use in copyright text, how big of an excerpt you can use. But I mean, this really is the frontier that we need to cross with these texts, because there is, there are now, over 100 years of data that might still be in copyright depending on when authors have died, and copyright rules are a mess and vary country by country, but there's a whole lot of cultural heritage that is shut off to us if we cannot study it computationally. So we can work together to fix this, as David Baman has done with his book NLP. You can create training data that looks more like your data to be able to answer questions, and we can use that data and those methods to answer questions that resonate with our colleagues in traditional literary studies. But I mean, it takes effort. Like that, those texts didn't annotate themselves with information about non-named characters, co-reference resolution and all of that. Like actual people, our colleagues in digital humanities spent time annotating those texts to be able to train the data, to be able to have better tools. And this is, I believe, fundamentally what we need to do if we want better resources for the languages that we work in and care about. Like, we need to build them, and we need to find people who work in those languages too and work together to annotate it, with all the caveats, unfortunately, about copyright and jurisdictions. So I was doing a bit of reading on the Hong Kong Copyright Amendment Ordinance, that lays out the copyright exemptions under the terms of fair dealing. there in the US, there's this concept of fair use, which is, the benefit is it's an open set. There is not a list of things that are allowed. There's this sort of vague set of terms and like considerations of things you need to think about, to be able to, determine whether something is a copyright infringement or fair use, and you can go ahead and do it. But there's not like a finite list of things that, you can and can't do. Fair dealing, on the other hand, which is kind of the more common framework, internationally, there is actually a closed set of things. And while there is some degree of squishiness, you don't have kind of the same like open-ended structure of fair use. And I think there's an interesting set of questions now about whether training an algorithm like Book NLP, especially if you don't release the training data, would this count as fair use, or fair dealings kind of within the framework of like the educational establishment exemption for these things. And I think a lot of this remains unanswered. In Europe, the question of whether an AI model is an infringing use or whether it's fair use or fair dealing is still unresolved, as it is in the US. And I suspect the way things are going, that US and Europe will end up going in different directions about what counts as legitimate use of copyrighted things. It's an interesting time out there for copyright issues, and we're really going to have to wait and see in a lot of these cases. Fundamentally, everyone is struggling with these questions right now. You're not alone. And I think that the way to make progress, if we can at all, is to just talk to each other and figure out what people can do in different contexts, and maybe if we can find workarounds that work for many of us internationally, by sort of leveraging the advantages and disadvantages of different copyright regimes. So I really love this stuff. I love grappling with even the messy, challenging questions of what we can do, how we can do it, and how we can do it better. Please, I'm happy to share these slides. Please get in touch if you're interested in collaborating. A lot of digital humanities, as I was saying towards the beginning, has reunited on a new app called Blue Sky that's currently invite only. There's a lot of discussion going on over there these days in a way that reminds me of the good old days of Twitter. If you'd be interested in joining Blue Sky, there's a link there that I'll share with these slides too. Just fill out the form and we're happy to hook you up with a code, and we hope to see you there. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Quinn, for the wonderfully thoughtful presentation, and really the range that you covered. You almost gave us a full semester's course in an hour, I think. So, or at least a sense of what that would look like. So that's great. That's really, really wonderful. The students and other participants can obviously type their questions in the chat, and I will relay them while they're thinking about it, and Quinn should take you should.
There we go.
There we go. Exactly. Exactly. Do the necessary. Yeah. Exactly. So I mean, there are lots of questions I want to ask, but I guess maybe I'll start with a question that isn't necessarily mine, but is one that sort of a lot of people ask, and I'd be interested to sort of hear your kind of take on it. So let's say a kind of typical kind of question from let's say a traditional humanist might be along the lines of, why should I be interested in this? I can't think of an example where digital or computational methods have ever changed a field. And of course, when people ask me that, I say, well, I mean, I could point to something that you mentioned. Well, if you're not reading any of the scholarship on the topic, then how do you know what it's doing at all? And I suppose they may or may not have a good answer. to that. But I'm wondering if you have a sort of a sort of a position on this kind of debate, or a sort of an answer you tend to give when you get this question, because I suspect you'll have had it in some form or another.
Usually I don't get it quite as harsh as that.
Okay.
Well, so I mean, like I would argue, you know, with that particular framing, that like changing the field is like a metric more of like, you know, within the field social dynamics than anything about the quality of the scholarship. You know, like
Okay.
if you actually look at like citational practices, you know, you want to say that like, obviously like the best stuff is what gets cited most, but like people cite things for all kinds of reasons, like including dunking on it. And you know, but realistically, like there's a set of things that like you cite, you know, somewhat like reverentially within the humanities. And you know, these things are often old in the humanities, and like way older than you see in other fields where like, you know, no one cites things from like more than 5 or 10 years ago at the most. There's like a set of core things like we all agree are like, you know, fundamental to the field. But then what people do besides that is they cite positionally. Like they cite the people that they are in discourse with, and because of these social dynamics of digital humanities kind of like being shoved off in the corner as like the weird cousin with the computer, you know, like it doesn't get cited, and so like of course it's not going to change the field if people are ignoring it. The easier to answer question that has less of a sociological answer, I you know I think is you know, pointing to things where you know, being able to look at texts and stuff at scale allows us to do things that, you know, or sort of answer questions that, you know, just would have been, you know, honestly like too expensive in terms of just like time and money and effort to do prior to this. So and remarkably, you know, coming from Slavic linguistics, there are examples of Soviet linguistics projects, and I mean in the US too, we have this where like, you know, projects that took like 70 years and employed like hundreds of grad students to like make a dictionary of something, you know, of an ancient language, or go through all of like a particularly set, you know, important set of historic documents. And like, you know, there are times and places in history where, you know, we have chosen to devote resources to doing this the hard way. You know, bless all of those grad students from the 20s and 30s and 40s at like, you know, the Chicago Dictionary of various ancient Near Eastern languages, or some of these Soviet projects looking at these documents where, you know, like grad students with index cards were doing this manually. They wrote down every time they saw an instance of this word and like what the sentence was, just like, you know, painstaking, torturous work. And like we can do this now quickly and easily. And you know, like what the impact of that has may not even be like the joy of like, behold, this thing exists, like, you know, which is great in and of itself, but like what does having that dictionary empower other people to do? Like if you have that dictionary, like what kinds of questions will spring to mind as things that are fundamentally answerable in a way that they aren't before? You know, or for instance, you know, with something that kind of like the intersection of history and literature, you know, Ryan Cordell's viral texts, like basically like looking at texts that went viral in American, you know, 19th century newspapers, and without the computational angle, I mean, again, it would take a tremendous amount of resources to like even try to track down like where was this text reprinted, and it's really easy to do computationally now. And I you know, particularly for the grad students, you know, I try to encourage the grad students in my department that they don't need to become digital humanists. Like I love it, the ones who decide that like they want to do digital humanities, identify as digital humanists, like they're great. I love them. But most people like don't, and honestly, maybe even shouldn't, if they want to go on the traditional job market, like brand themselves that way. Like what you can do is you can become a stealth digital humanist. You know, where you do like, maybe you don't do some of the more like computationally fancy stuff, at least you don't present them in your final paper, but like what you do in the privacy of your own computer, you know, no one needs to know. You know, suddenly you might be like a close reading, traditional looking, you know, humanities scholar who just has a knack for finding every single example of a word, or finding every example of words that like actually occur with like a weird ratio in like these sets of text versus those sets of text. Like, you don't have to tell anyone how you get there, the same way that like traditional humanists like don't necessarily write out in their papers every, you know, train of thought that led them down the path they did. Like, and you can do the same, and you don't have to like, you know, wear the t-shirt of digital humanities, and like that's okay too.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, I really like that last point, and it sort of chimes actually with something that, if you remember at the recent conference, Anya, Anya was describing herself, I think, in very similar terms. Yeah, no, it sort of occurs to me, I guess, then sort of what you're describing, the kind of computational methods as a way to kind of expand the reach of your project, is that in a sense some way more suited to, I guess, a kind of continental model of the humanities, you know, a kind of like a, you know, like a kind of German humanities professor versus, you know, with his kind of, you know, his graduate students and his project to, you know, create a dictionary of Akkadian, versus the more kind of Anglo-American model where you know, it's the one professor sitting in his office in, you know, Palo Alto or Cambridge, Massachusetts, writing this kind of interpretive monograph. Do you think that plays into the relative popularity, in some senses, or institutionalization of the digital humanities in Europe versus the United States, say?
Yeah, no, I mean that's a really good point. Yeah, and I think both the sort of like, you know, overall continental educational model, and just as crucially, if not more so, the funding
Yeah.
available for that model, is essential for being able to do things. I mean, certainly, you know, from the States, even coming from like a well-resourced place like Stanford, you know, you look towards Western Europe, and you're like, wow, that's got to be nice.
Yeah.
You know, like the just the idea of being like their existing funding that you could apply for to be able to do a project like that, or have a bunch of, you know, grad students in a lab like all working towards a common goal. You know, like it boggles my mind as an American, like what that's got to be like. It seems great. Like, I realize there are challenges like on the individual
Well,
level and on the systemic level too. um yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting you know, challenges for kind of more of the individual like person working on a project or like working on a monograph thing, you know, in the US at least, is this question of like, how do you learn to do this anyways? And this is one of the things that, you know, we're trying to combat with the Data Setters Club, you know, recognizing that like, you know, I'm at Stanford, and like where you go to learn this stuff is you like go to the literary lab meetings. Like, they're, you know, now Tuesday mornings, and you show up there 10 to 12, and like you can learn the things you would need to know to be able to go off and like use these methods like in your own, you know, office with like maybe one TA if you get funding for that, like, you know, at the you know, Ohio State University where you'll end up, or what have you. Um but for a lot of people, like if you're not in one of these major hubs of computational text analysis, like it's really hard to break into that world. And so I think there's a really big educational component that's really important and missing. You know, thinking about like, how do we get this knowledge of how you would go about doing this like out to more people? So I mean, we have the Data Sitters Club. That's, you know, my small effort to you know, write through how you would do this, and share it beyond the confines of the lab. Obviously, Programming Historian is just a gem of a project, and you know, has been essential for so many people to develop those kinds of skills. Workshop series like what you have, you know, here in the library, are just a fantastic resource to be able to, because I mean, most people, like, we can create as many web-based resources as we want, but like, you know, honestly, what most people need, you know, myself included, is just like a space to go and like actually sit down with someone and like work through it. And so I mean, I think there's a role, there's absolutely an essential role for like, you know, people running, you know, in-person workshops, you know, or virtual workshops even, to actually give people, you know, the experience of like, all right, this is the time I have to sit down and focus and learn this stuff. And there will be someone there to answer my questions in a way that like these web-based resources, for all their good intentions and value, can't do by themselves.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks for mentioning all those various resources. Students should also note that there are also 4-credit classes taught by myself and others that they can also take. Other
Classes are great.
Other
Take the classes.
other courses are available, but I do teach some. But I'm wondering. So one of the things I think I see students struggle with is it's not necessarily the initial identification of a certain number of resources or attending these various events, but there's that kind of moment where you have to kind of marry, I guess, the sort of technical knowledge that you acquire with that kind of humanistic question answering kind of side of your brain. Of course, a good workshop kind of does both and integrates them into a kind of, into some sort of logical narrative that they can, students can kind of grab onto and be pulled along by. But I'm wondering how you sort of think about either in your teaching or your practice.
Yeah, the coming up with a question is like really like the moment of truth in all of this. And often, yeah, I mean, this comes up a lot with my students too, and honestly with me, and it's there are several points in the Data Sitters Club books where like I or someone else like have an idea for a question, and then we realize that like it's not a computational question, and like that's okay. But it's sort of an awkward point as we're trying to write these computational books that like this is just like the wrong method for this question. And it's also not always obvious, even after you've been doing this for some time, like what questions could be sort of shaped or approached in a way that the computer can facilitate, versus some that just like really aren't and are ultimately like interpretive questions. And like maybe you could use a computer to gather some data, but like the computer, there's no algorithm you can use that will really like get you closer to an answer to the question. And so
could you give an example of that, maybe just because surely I mean there'll be people thinking, well, there'll be people on one side thinking, well, no humanistic question can be computational, and there'll be some people thinking, well, of course any question can be computational.
Everything will work.
Yeah. So how do you decide?
Yeah, so there's actually like an XKCD comic that is one of my favorites. With the like sort of like two questions that like on the surface like seem really similar. One is like how many birds are like in this geographic area, versus like could you like identify like I don't know, like identify the birds or something like that. And like one is like, oh yeah, I can get this for you like tomorrow. The other is like, I need a team of grad students and 10 years of funding. I mean, like closer to the humanities. Maybe it's just because it's getting late and I'm slightly hungry and thinking of the most recent Data Sitters Club we put together. But we our most recent piece was on corpus building, and the question of like how do you, because this is often the question, like the questions that you can ask depend on what you're looking at, like the specifics of what you're looking at. And so how you build your corpus is so essential to like getting any answer at all, let alone one that you sort of like feel satisfied by. And so we sort of played out the scenario of the question of looking at pizza in youth literature, and comparing references to pizza in winners and or like nominees for the Newbery Award, which is like the big US children's book award, compared to just like series books, which is kind of an ill-defined thing. But yeah, books that have like many books in the series, often sort of associated with like crappy children's books. And what we found was the number of books, like series books that had a reference to pizza, was way higher than the Newbery Award winners. But once you like sort of like dealt with like basically time as a factor, like the fact that like no one was writing about pizza before like the 1960s, or like really the 80s was when it really exploded as a food, just because pizza wasn't really a thing, or like chain pizza restaurants weren't a thing until then, right? Once you correct for that, and like starting in 2000, if you look at like the Newbery Award winners plus the nominees who like could have won the award, all of a sudden actually Newbery Award nominees mention pizza more frequently than the series books. And so like sort of dealing with that sort of shift in the results, the like like a naive and bad conclusion that you could reach would be like, well, obviously like there's a pizza curse going on, and like if you mention pizza in your book you might get nominated for this prestigious award, but you will absolutely not get it. So the advice to authors should be to never mention pizza if you want the chance of winning a Newbery. And like obviously that's ridiculous, like that's not what's going on here, but like teasing out what is going on here might involve other kinds of computational queries, but at the end of the day, like I think that's more of a close reading interpretive problem. And like there's certainly not going to be like an algorithm that will, I think, have the visualization that will like make it all like click in your head. Like this is a close reading, this is a sociology, this is a like reading about like the history of the prizes and the juries and things like that. But it like the computational bit of like finding where pizza exists in a speedy manner, that like having to like have sticky notes for where you see pizza like doesn't have to be part of your workflow, like that can be useful, but it's not gonna like solve it for you. Whereas something like, let's look at how common whaling tales were in 19th century popular literature. If you have a good corpus like Mark Algie Hewitt had for the Typicality Project, like that is one where like you run the computational algorithm and like there is an answer there. You can see what percentage of books were in the whaling tales, and like that is something that like you can answer in a way that like what's up with pizza and the award winners is not so easy.
And just to follow up on this question of sort of corpora, then, so what do you, so if the sort of the challenge to some extent is kind of creating the right corpus, and only then asking the right question of it, there are these sort of pre-made corpora out there of various sorts, some bigger than others, but people are creating their own all the time. What sort of best practices exist for making those available to other people within, of course, the the prison of copyright? So
yeah, so that there's the legal way and there's what people actually do.
okay.
What people actually do, just like frankly in practice, is they pass each other flash drives of files at conferences, or have something on Google Drive that they just like quietly share with someone. I mean, you certainly can't like publish it or kind of adhere to good principles of open science and open data when you write about it, right? You can't be like, and you can view my corpus here. There are efforts to make some degree of meaningful derivative data available. So Ben Schmidt has a set of algorithms that like create derivatives similar to the HuTrust extracted features that can make some information about these texts available. So like, I mean, what I've I've thought about this a lot, and for the large youth literature corpus I use for this like pizza inquiry, probably we are gonna make that derivative data available at some point, once we start publishing on this corpus. But I mean, honestly, what people have to do that is like the closest official thing that you can do is just basically provide a list of like what books you used, and sort of with the like hand wave of like, and if you were to get a copy of this book somewhere, I'm not going to give you one, I can't give you one, but if you were to find on the internet, possibly on a pirate site or some other, or scanning it yourself is a thing that you could do. If you were to find a copy of these books, you would get similar results, right?
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, there's like right now there's just a big gap between what we are allowed to do legally, what we do in practice, and the different ways of navigating that. And I mean, this varies just so much between countries that like even if you're like really trying hard to like follow all the laws, like chances are you're gonna screw it up just because of how messy it is, and it gets even more messy once you deal with international borders.
No, no, of course. I ask because there's sort of a movement in slavery studies, to kind of put, coming out of the slave voyages database,
Yeah.
to move towards a more kind of open data, open science kind of model. And there's even a journal, the Journal of Data and Slavery Studies,
Yeah.
and I'm sure
It's
there are
easier
others.
with history. I mean, both
Yes,
because it's old,
yeah,
and because it's facts. The fact, yeah, like facts can't be copyrighted. Um,
mm,
like in and of themselves. I mean, like right, this is how like Wikipedia can work, right? Like people put facts there and they put citations, and you can do that.
mm,
Literature inherently is messier. Um,
yeah,
like there are facts about books, you can do a plot synopsis, right? Like those are facts about like what happened in the book. You can do derivative statistics about like word frequencies and stuff like that, but yeah, just inherently because of its nature, literature is harder than history with some of this stuff, at
mm.
least. Maybe the historians would disagree, and that's a great conversation I'd love to have
Oh,
over a beer someday about who's got
yes,
it
yes,
worse. But
yeah, exactly,
at
exactly.
least from where I'm sitting in a literature department, it feels like there are
Mm,
different. I think certainly uncontroversially, like there are different sets of considerations and constraints when you're dealing with history versus literature.
sure, sure, sure. And to some extent, because there are kind of numbers and facts that we can extract from documents, these kind of
Right.
like meta historical documents are actually quite useful to us, whereas the text is the center of the universe to some extent in literary
Yeah.
studies. Um, so I see we only have a couple of minutes, but I'm wondering if we could go back to actually one of the very first things you said. Um, and you were talking kind of about the kind of the future of the humanities, and you maybe had some sort of slightly dark things to say about a possible future which we obviously want to avoid. But I'm wondering if we could sort of switch the use kind of digital humanities as a kind of hub here, and kind of switch the perspective, and say it seems to me, I mean, there are also people coming from, say, computer science, statistics, data science, whatever we want to call it, who are also becoming interested, or maybe have always been interested in humanistic questions, and are coming at these things, are sort of maybe tending towards the
Hmm.
digital humanities. And I'm wondering what you think of a world in which, maybe even if there aren't traditional humanities subjects as we understand them today, there are people asking these sort of same kind of questions. And I'm thinking of people like people who are housed in CS departments like Donald
Hmm.
Sturgeon in sinology, and David Mimno, right?
Yeah.
So is there kind of a story there, and
There,
what should we know about
yeah.
it?
So there are better and worse examples of this, and I think the two examples that you've given are like the best of them. Like those are the folks in CS who I just adore working with. Like they're very thoughtful about what they do, like the limits of what they do and how that intersects with like the existing fields of literary study and even kind of like humanities based like DH. Yeah, I mean, like even though they're in CS, and like you couldn't really mistake them for anything else, they like are very thoughtful and careful. There's also the bad flavor of this, which we also see a lot of, where someone with like a splash of statistics and a little CS like waltzes in with data science, and we're like, hi, I've just solved your field for you.
Hmm.
Why aren't you applauding?
Yeah.
Like, and then these, like, there was God, culturenomics was the name of like this movement, like
Oh,
maybe 10 or 20 years ago, There were some very splashy articles that were basically like computational humanities stuff, and like
Okay.
all of the humanists just hated this,
Mm,
because they again, like, yeah, waltzed in with like large corpora as those started becoming available, and made some sweeping conclusions, not really thinking carefully about like, what is this data, where did it come from, what does it actually
mm,
represent, like, what is not included in these data sets, like what is missing, why is it missing, like how does
mm,
that, like, make our conclusions more humble, or should make our conclusions more humble. This was like a really interesting like moment of I don't want to say like quite crisis, but like, certainly there was a lot of conflict with people who wanted to like solve the humanities using these methods,
mm.
and just like fundamentally missing the point that like it doesn't work like that. um and I
Yeah.
mean, I think, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, where like, maybe there are some questions that like, like we could all be better if people would be willing to like open their minds to the possibility that like there might actually be an answer to this question. Sort of things like authorship attribution, right? Like those are things that I feel pretty comfortable about saying like we could solve it and then we could be done talking about this. But of course, like most of the humanities is not like quite so cut and dried.
Mm,
And you know yeah, I feel like there's been a little bit more by way of like epistemic humility from the CS side, like after, I mean, like it happens every few years that like someone tries to solve the humanities, gets yelled at a lot and like goes away, and then like it happens again a few years down the line. But I feel like maybe like the message is getting across that like, if nothing else, like things are weird over there and you can't just like
mm,
apply an algorithm and expect like a positive community reaction.
mm. Okay. Well, I guess we can only hope that, yeah, I guess this, we call the sort of cultural analytics movement. That's what they called it Berkeley, I know now, in their kind of, in the way they're
Yeah,
rearranging things. So,
yeah. I mean, I think everyone's trying to like, find a name that like gets at it without making too many people angry. But yeah, I mean,
yeah,
there is like a journal of cultural analytics that is, that basically tries to be this sort of like thoughtful, computational, but ultimately like humanistically grounded, like, scholarship, like that stuff tends to be quite good.
yeah,
So yeah, I mean, I think the real question though is, how do we make inroads with the traditional folks to like make the case that this is relevant and they should care,
yeah,
lest we just like keep fragmenting into smaller groups, each with like slightly different names, none of which talk to each other, and like no one's getting funding, and I think like that's the worst possible
yeah,
organizational outcome.
yeah. All right. Well, on that on that sort of exhortation, I guess, to do better and certainly to do more DH. I think we should
Go talk
probably
to
wrap things
people.
up. Go talk to people.
Yes,
Exactly. Be friendly.
yes.
Um, I think we should probably then thank our speaker for the really wonderful presentation and very stimulating discussion. And thank you to you all for coming. We'll see you all next week for Adam Crimble's presentation. All right. Good afternoon, good night, wherever you happen to be in the world.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you for
bye-bye.
having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Bye.
Bye.